Simpa Oren Minyak is the name of a 1958 film that many fans of The Oily Maniac might not know was the original movie. The Oily Maniac is actually a remake of an old Malaysian film which was produced by Run Run Shaw, and it was shot in the Bahasa Malaysian language. It's a black and white film, and it was directed by the legendary P. Ramlee, who was a most iconic Malaysian filmmaker who unfortunately died very suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 44. He is iconised in Kuala Lumpur with the memorial, which was launched in 1986. P. Ramlee was known for many films. One of his most famous is a film called Ibu Mertuaka, which translates as mother-in-law. But he directed many films, he was also the star of many films, and he was a singer as well. His association with Run Run Shaw for the original Oily Maniac, which actually translates as Curse of the Oily Man, was a success in its native Malaysia. It's a very different film from Oily Maniac. It's almost like a fairy tale. It's a film about a man who is actually a rapist, and he becomes this oily maniac. The Oily Maniac costume is simply some black paint on his face and a black costume. And nevertheless, he haunts a Malaysian village in the year 1901, and we see implied rape off screen. And at the end of the film, just as it seems he's about to rape his next victim, somebody from the village comes and captures him, and via a spell manages to keep him in a very small jar. So it's a very different film from Oily Maniac. It's not really an exploitation film. Like I say, it's shot in quite beautiful black and white. It's got a very whimsical soundtrack. At times it looks like a fairy tale. There's a traditional Malaysian fight at the end with swords and the dress. And like I say, it's a film which I've not come across any review of the 1976 Oily Maniac which acknowledges it's actually a remake, but it's a very different film, and I'll explain why this is. The 1976 Oily Maniac begins by telling us it is based on a Nanyang tall tale. Well, what does that mean? The film doesn't actually tell us anything more than that. All we know is that we are then in Malaysia, but unlike the 1958 film, this film is not shot in Bahasa Malaysian, and nobody in the film is speaking that language. Of course, if you go to Malaysia today, people will speak to you either in Bahasa Malaysian or in English. Mandarin or Cantonese is only spoken within the pockets of the Chinese community. So watching Oily Maniac, seeing it set in Malaysia where the police are not talking Bahasa Malaysian is a little bit strange. But there's more than that which is different about it. For a start, although it says it's based on a Nanyang tall tale, well, it's not actually staying true to the tale of the Oily Maniac. In the folklore of Southeast Asia, the Nanyang tall tales, they came from Indonesia and spread into Malaysia and Thailand. This is the case with this story of the curse of the oily man. And yeah, the film actually doesn't follow the curse or the story of the curse very well. In the 1958 film, it's actually a wronged man, and this wronged man is given the chance to do a deal with the devil, but he must rape 21 virgins a month. So he's very much the villain of the piece. There's no real sympathy that we have for him, as you can imagine. And this is part of the urban folklore of the Oily Maniac. Although how somebody becomes an Oily Maniac, it's not necessarily just a deal with the devil. In Malaysian folklore, it can also be a deal with a shaman, and it can even be a deal with a witch doctor. When the film came out, there were further legends that started to be spoken about this legend of the oily man. Some say that he is invisible to anybody who is not a virgin. He's only after virgins, so non-virgins need not worry, and they'll never see him. Others say that he's a naked oily man, and he's impossible to catch, hence the oil. I've looked into this, and apparently the legend comes from a series of rapes which took place in either Indonesia or Malaysia, where the police never caught the perpetrator, and the villagers began a rumour that the perpetrator was actually an oily ghost. He was so slippery he could never be found. And that's how it grew over the decades into this curse of the oily man. After Malaysian independence and obviously the rule of law becoming Sharia law and the prominence of Islam in the country's religion, the story of the oily man, the oily maniac, has only really been spoken about or, you know, kept alive in the Chinese communities. It's seen as a harem among the Muslim communities of Malaysia, as in it's not unclean folktale. Which brings us, I think, to the 1976 version, because I think when you watch it, you can tell that it's not really designed to be seen in an Islamic country, to say the least. The 1976 version, by all accounts, came out in Hong Kong and was not a success. It looks as if it only ever played Taiwan. It's really quite an interesting situation, because you have this story which came from Indonesia and Malaysia during the time of their colonization. In the case of Indonesia, it was the colonization of the Dutch, by the Dutch. In the case of Malaysia, the colonization by the British. But yet these folk tales were kept alive. And if we go back and look, there's many, to this day, Malaysian folk tales which we, which are still spoken about and acknowledged, but only in these small communities. For instance, there's Pontianak, who is a female vampire, and in Malaysian culture, she has long fingernails, and she's a seductress, and she waits under trees at night, seeking her next victim. Interestingly, she's also said to have very long black hair, which engulfs her head, and wears a long white dress. It's actually the precursor to Sadako of Ringu, I think. So, you know, some of these, Nanyang folktales, they've certainly gained traction and influenced other aspects of Asian culture, even East Asian culture. Another one is Toyo, who's a small child who dies in the womb but is brought back via black magic. And this Toyo, this ghost child, he can be kept alive for his mother or father, but the payout is that the rest of their family will suffer ill health and die. If you look at the sort of soul dolls that are prevalent in Thai culture to this day, you can see that kind of Nanyang legend live on, for instance. Pontianak Harum Sundo was a 2004 film released in Malaysia, which was quite successful, and it also addresses Nanyang tall tales and traditional Indonesian, Malaysian ghost stories. So these are still very, very popular to this day. The 1976 Oily Maniac, to return to that, yeah, it does seem a very strange bet, because it's a film which of course features rape. Now, rape is a big aspect of the Oily Maniac tale. When it started to spread from Indonesia to Malaysia, there was even a Malaysian saying which was "virgins do not go out at night," and it became a warning to your daughter to stay in as night fell. So the thing is, yeah, okay, rape is a part of this, but what's really strange in the 1976 Oily Maniac is it's turning this Nanyang tall tale in its head. It's making Danny Lee this heroic oily maniac. He is somebody who appears to do justice and then disappears. He's fighting and killing the bad people. He's actually saving one woman who's of course spread on a gynecological table. She's about to have her hymen restored at the wish of a very sleazy business orientated male, and an oily maniac appears from the ceiling to stop this miscarriage of justice. There's even a scene in the courts, so it's it's very much about Danny Lee as the honourable oily maniac. So although it says it's based on a Nanyang tall tale, it's doing the exact opposite of the tall tale. In the original tall tale, as seen in the 1958 film, the oily maniac is to be feared. He's a rapist. He has to rape to stay this you know, oily creature. Whereas in the 1976 film, it's completely different. He's like a superhero. He's totally the opposite. If anything, I would say that the 1976 version of the Oily Maniac, if I was to compare it to any other Shaw Brothers film of this era, it's kind of like The Killer Snakes, because it's very much a story of somebody who's got some kind of handicap. In the case of the Danny Lee character in The Oily Maniac, he's literally, you know, crippled. He's got that handicap, and then he gains super strength as the Oily Maniac. In The Killer Snakes, we have a sort of Norman Bates type, sexually repressed loner, you know, who lives in poverty in Hong Kong. And you know, we see the markets, the bustling markets outside his kind of, you know, leaking, grimy apartment. And then he makes friends with snakes who are able to avenge, you know, his repressions, you know, who are able to come out and give him a voice, give him strength. And I think that's a film that I'd compare it most to. I mean, the thing about the Shaw Brothers is that they had this offshoot in horror cinema, but the horror cinema was never... With you know, some examples, with some rare examples, like Hex was a huge success in Thailand, for instance. But in a lot of cases, films such as Killer Snakes and films such as Oily Maniac just kind of came and went. You know, they played Hong Kong and, you know, Taiwan, and that was actually just about it when it came to Asia, because the censorship laws meant that films which featured a lot of rape, featured a lot of nudity, were not really going to travel to Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and so it's very, very bizarre, actually, that Oily Maniac is one of these films that's been remembered. It's not even got a DVD release in Hong Kong, to the best of my knowledge. You can only find it, I think, in Taiwan. So it's a film which has actually been really underseen. And the 1958 version, the Malaysian version, is so obscure, even though, as I said, the director, P. Ramlee, is a huge icon in his native Malaysia. So it's quite amazing to see this film now out there, and to see this legend of the oily man live on for a new generation. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I would say if you like Oily Maniac, definitely check out Killer Snakes. Bizarrely enough, they actually have quite a bit in common. But yeah, the Shaw Brothers would often default into filming in Malaysia. They did it with Black Magic as well. And if you look at a recent Hong Kong horror film called The Sleep Curse, which is by Herman Yao, who did Untold Story and Ebola Syndrome, what's really interesting is that they have a sequence where they go to Penang, a city in Malaysia, and they don't really need to take the film to Penang, but I sort of like to think it's Herman Yao sort of winking his eye to the Oily Maniac and to Black Magic, and kind of saying, remember when these old Shaw films went to Malaysia and told you these little tall tales and, you know, kind of wrapped themselves into some sort of, you know, folklore? I like to think that's actually his nod to these films from the past. I really hope that discussing some of these tall tales gives you a new perspective on the Oily Maniac. I hope it encourages you to go and find a way to look at the 1958 version and compare them both. The 1958 version, as I said, very much a film about Malaysian folklore. And I really hope that, you know, ideally somebody watching this gets interested enough to read a little bit about Malaysia and visit. It's a fascinating country, a melting pot of cultures and religions, and somewhere that I would strongly advise anybody takes a chance to go and be a tourist in.